We recognize this story. Wise men, a guiding star, a sacred birth. But the authorized version is not the original one. The real story doesn't begin in a gospel. It begins here. Carved into a mountain in Iran, 500 years before the birth of Christ. This is the first historical record of a Magus, a single clue that points to a far deeper mystery. It reveals a recurring pattern etched into human consciousness across the globe. This is not just a religious story. It is the blueprint for a certain kind of spiritual awakening, and understanding this pattern is to understand the very nature of a conscious quest. Our modern world has a difficult relationship with myth. We are trained from a young age to place every story we encounter into one of two rigid boxes. Either it is a literal, historical fact, provable and solid, or it is a fiction, a fairy tale with little relevance to the complexities of our actual lives. This binary choice forces us into an impossible corner. It demands that we sacrifice either our intellect for the sake of faith, or our innate sense of wonder for the sake of cold, hard reason. But this is a false choice, a limitation of our own cultural perspective, and it is the source of a great deal of our spiritual disconnection. The ancients understood implicitly that there is a third way to see, a way that reconciles the mind and the soul. This is the way of the true myth. A true myth is not concerned with what happened once, long ago, to someone else. It is concerned with what is happening always, within everything and within us. It functions like a kind of spiritual source code. Consider the software that runs our digital world. We interact with dozens of different applications, each with its own unique design and purpose. But beneath them all lies a fundamental operating system, a source code that dictates the underlying logic and potential for every program. A true myth is the source code for human consciousness. The specific stories, the names of the gods and heroes, the locations and the languages, these are the applications, customized for different cultures and eras. But the underlying pattern, the deep resonant logic of the soul's journey, remains constant and universal. The purpose of a channel like this one is to learn how to look past the application and begin to read the code itself. This is not merely a poetic idea. It was given a profound psychological framework in the 20th century. The psychologist Carl Jung, in his exploration of the human psyche, discovered that this spiritual source code was real and observable. He identified its components as archetypes, primal patterns, universal blueprints existing within what he called the collective unconscious. These archetypes are not learned from the outside. They are the inherited potentials of the human mind itself, a kind of psychic DNA. They are the recurring characters in the dreams of all humanity, the noble king, the innocent child, the destructive tyrant. And one of the most powerful and important archetypes, especially for a seeker of wisdom, is the one we will be exploring. The archetype of the sage, the wise seeker, the part of us that embarks on a conscious quest for a connection to the divine. A true myth, then, is a story that activates this archetype, giving it a face and a journey so that we can finally recognize it within ourselves. Long before modern psychology, the ancient philosophers had their own language for this universal pattern. They called it the Logos. For the Greek thinkers, from Heraclitus to the Stoics, the Logos was the divine reason, the intelligent and ordering principle that pervades the entire cosmos. It is the logic embedded in the fabric of reality itself. A true myth, from this perspective, is a narrative that has managed to harmonize with the Logos. It is a story that captures a fragment of this universal truth in a form the human mind can comprehend. And this is crucial. Perceiving the Logos and the myths that reflect it is not a matter of passive belief. It requires effort, discipline, and the tuning of one's own consciousness. It is the story of how the human mind learns to perceive the intelligent pattern of the universe and align itself with that flow. So, to engage with the myth of the Magi is not to ask, "Did this really happen?" but to ask the far more potent question, "What fundamental truth about reality and my own consciousness is this story revealing?" To find this source code, our investigation must begin with the first line ever written, the historical identity of the Magus. To begin our investigation, we must anchor ourselves in the bedrock of history. Our first piece of evidence is not a mystical text, but a raw testament of power carved into a limestone cliff face in modern-day Iran. It is the Behistun inscription. Commissioned by King Darius the Great around 522 BC, this massive rock relief proclaims his victory and rightful place on the throne. And in this ancient royal decree, we find the first undisputed historical mention of a Magus by name, Gomata, a rival and usurper to the throne. This inscription is crucial. It tells us that the Magi were not mere legends. They were real, they were influential, and they operated at the very highest levels of political power. Our next source comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing just a few decades later. He described the Magi not simply as priests, but as a specific tribe of the Medes who held a hereditary monopoly on all religious and ritualistic functions within the Persian Empire. Nothing of sacred importance could be done without one of them present. They were the interpreters of dreams, the diviners of the future, the intermediaries between the will of the gods and the destinies of empires. In modern terms, one might think of them as a kind of spiritual intelligence agency, tasked with the monumental responsibility of interpreting the will of the cosmos for the most powerful empire on Earth. Their council could launch armies, establish kings, and shape the course of history. This is where we must clarify a word that has been clouded by centuries of misunderstanding: magic. Our modern word, magic, comes directly from their name, from the Greek word magia, which simply meant the art and science of the Magi. But their practice was not the stage magic of illusion or the dark arts of fantasy. Magia was the science of understanding the hidden mechanics of the universe and aligning human will with the greater currents of cosmic law. It was not about breaking the laws of nature, but about mastering them through a profound understanding of their inner logic. This was a discipline, a rigorous path that required immense knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and the subtle energies of the natural world. It was a science of active participation with reality itself. And it is vital to understand that the Magi were not an isolated phenomenon. At roughly the same time in the Greek world, another elite intellectual and spiritual school was flourishing, the Pythagoreans. While the Magi studied the heavens, the school of Pythagoras sought to understand the cosmos through the language of number, music, and geometry. Both groups, though separated by geography and culture, were founded on the same radical premise: that the universe is not random or chaotic, but is a rational, harmonious, and ultimately decipherable reality. Both believed that by mastering a sacred language, be it the language of the stars or the language of mathematics, the human mind could come into direct communion with the mind of God. This comparison elevates the Magi from provincial soothsayers to what they truly were: philosopher-scientists, engaged in a global, ancient effort to map the unseen world. Their authority, then, did not come from superstition or political maneuvering alone. It came from their claimed ability to read a divine language, written not in ink, but in fire, the language of the heavens. For them, the universe was not silent. It was broadcasting a message, and they were the ones who had learned how to listen. To understand how the Magi listened to the cosmos, we must first understand the world they lived in. Not a world of dead matter and empty space, but a universe that was profoundly alive. The foundational philosophy that underpinned their sacred science was the concept of the anima mundi, the world soul. They perceived the entire cosmos not as a machine, but as a single, vast, intelligent organism. Everything within it, from the smallest grain of sand to the most distant star, was a cell in the body of this one living being, interconnected and infused with consciousness. This is the key that unlocks their entire system. When you see the universe as alive, the planets and stars are no longer just balls of rock and gas. They become the organs, the nerve centers, the visible thoughts of the divine mind. This perspective completely transforms the purpose of astrology. In this framework, the movements of the planets were not seen as crude, mechanical causes forcing events to happen on Earth, the way one billiard ball strikes another. That is a modern, materialistic misunderstanding. For the Magi, the celestial movements were symptoms, not causes. They were the grand gestures, the changing facial expressions on the singular face of the cosmos. To read the stars was to read the mood, the intention, the unfolding thought pattern of the universe itself. It was a diagnostic art, not a deterministic one. They were not just predicting the future. They were attempting to comprehend the present moment in its fullest, most cosmic context. They were reading the mind of God. This idea of a unified, interconnected reality finds one of its most elegant expressions in the philosophy of the ancient Stoics, who called it sympatheia. The word means fellow feeling, and it describes the principle that all parts of the cosmos are in sympathy with each other, bound together by a universal web of cause and effect. As the emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul." For a mind that understands sympatheia, it is not strange to think that an event in the heavens corresponds to an event on Earth. They are not two separate events linked by a mysterious force, but two different manifestations of a single, underlying movement within the one being. This is the logic that made astrology a profound science to the Magi. And it is here, in this ancient intuition of cosmic unity, that we find a startling, though conceptual, parallel with some of the most advanced ideas in modern science. We must be careful not to draw false equivalencies, but the principle of quantum entanglement serves as a powerful metaphor for what the Magi intuited. Entanglement describes a phenomenon where two particles can be linked in such a way that they behave as a single system, no matter how far apart they are. Measuring a property of one particle instantly influences the corresponding property of the other, faster than the speed of light. This is not to say that astrology is quantum physics. It is to say that our deepest scientific explorations are reaffirming a fundamental truth the Magi took for granted: that separation is, on some fundamental level, an illusion, and that the universe is far more interconnected than our everyday senses lead us to believe. But this profound wisdom, this perception of a unified and living reality, carried within it a shadow. To ignore this shadow is to misunderstand the full story of human spirituality. We must now turn to the historical record, to a Magus whose power became absolute, and see what happens when sacred knowledge is no longer content to merely listen to the cosmos, but seeks to control it. Wisdom, when it intersects with institutional power, faces its greatest and most perilous test. The romantic image of the mystical wandering sage is only one half of the story. To understand the full picture, we must also confront its shadow. Our investigation now leads us from the dawn of the Persian Empire to its powerful Sasanian era in the 3rd century AD. Here we meet the most well-documented Magus in all of history, a man named Kartir. Kartir was no mythical figure following a star. He was a high priest of immense influence, a political operator at the highest level, and he left behind a series of inscriptions carved into rock, detailing his life's work for all of posterity to see. These inscriptions are an unflinching look at what happens when sacred knowledge is no longer a tool for liberation, but a weapon of control. In his own proud words, etched in stone, Kartir boasts of his success in consolidating religious authority. He describes a systematic campaign to establish a rigid orthodoxy for the Zoroastrian faith, and to purify the empire by suppressing other spiritual paths that had flourished there for centuries. He speaks of bringing ruin and persecution upon the followers of Manichaeism, of scattering the communities of Christians, Jews, Mandaeans, and even Buddhists. We must look at Kartir not as a simple villain from the past, but as a crucial case study in a timeless, universal human pattern, the process by which living wisdom can curdle, harden, and fossilize into rigid dogma. His story is an archetype in itself. It is the story of how a spiritual path, which begins with a profound, liberating insight, can devolve into an institution obsessed with its own preservation and power. This is a phenomenon that modern psychology has given a powerful name: the spiritual ego. It is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous trap on any path of self-knowledge. The spiritual ego is the tendency of the human ego to seize upon spiritual concepts, insights, and experiences, not for the purpose of transcendence, but for the purpose of building a stronger, more refined, and special identity. The ego takes ownership of the wisdom. It begins to believe, "I have the truth." This thought quickly and inevitably morphs into, "We have the only truth," and finally culminates in the dangerous conclusion, "Those who do not share our truth are a threat to the truth itself." Kartir's triumphant inscriptions are a chilling testament to a fully developed spiritual ego operating at the level of an empire. He represents the part of the human psyche that fears any wisdom that comes from outside its own self-constructed system, the part that mistakes the container for the sacred water it holds. As the great sages throughout history remind us, the map is not the territory. Kartir's story perfectly illustrates the critical, eternal distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric dimensions of religion. The exoteric is the outer shell, the institutions, the public rituals, the written laws, the dogma. It is the structure designed for the community, meant to provide order, identity, and a shared container for belief. The esoteric is the inner kernel, the mystical experience, the direct, personal, and often solitary search for communion with the divine. It is the living, breathing spirit of the path. The mythical Magi of our quest represent the esoteric soul, the individual seekers, the mystics, following an inner, unmediated star. Kartir, in his historical reality, represents the exoteric structure in its most rigid and defensive form, more concerned with protecting the institution than with fostering the inner experience that gave birth to it. This historical tension, this eternal struggle between the seeking mystic and the rigid priest, is not just a footnote to our story. It creates the spiritual necessity for the myth we are about to explore. It demonstrates why a story like the one preserved in the Gospel of Matthew was so revolutionary. It was a story designed to bypass the hardened shell of orthodoxy, to break through the walls of religious and cultural exclusivity, and to speak directly to the wandering, seeking, and universal soul of the true Magi. Now our investigation shifts from the broad landscape of history to the focused intensity of a single revolutionary text. The story of the Magi appears in only one place in the canonical Bible, a brief 12-verse narrative in the Gospel of Matthew. To the casual reader, it is a simple, charming addition to the Christmas story. But to an esoteric reader, it is a profound and radical spiritual gambit. To understand its power, we must first appreciate the context. The Gospel of Matthew is deeply concerned with establishing Jesus' identity within the Jewish tradition. It begins with a long, meticulous genealogy tracing his lineage back to King David and to Abraham. The entire narrative is structured to present him as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. And then, into this carefully constructed, culturally specific narrative, the author makes a shocking move. The very first people outside of the immediate family to recognize and honor this King of the Jews are not priests from the temple in Jerusalem, not respected rabbis, not even devout Israelites. They are outsiders, foreigners, Persian astrologers, practitioners of a spiritual science often viewed with suspicion. This is the esoteric gambit. The story asserts that the first validation of the arrival of the Messiah came not from the keepers of the established religion, but from masters of an entirely different wisdom tradition. The function of this choice is clear. It is to demonstrate that the arrival of the Logos, the divine word made manifest, is not a local event. It is a cosmic event, and its significance can be perceived by anyone whose consciousness is sufficiently trained to read the signs, regardless of their culture, their religion, or their tradition. It is a profound statement that universal wisdom, Sophia, recognizes its own source, wherever it may appear. This was not a random choice of outsiders. The connection between the Persian Magi and the birth of a world savior was already ancient. As we have seen, the Magi were inheritors of the Zoroastrian tradition, and a central prophecy of Zoroastrianism was the coming of a figure called the Saoshyant. The prophecy foretold that at the end of an age, a world savior would be born of a virgin, conceived through the light of a star. He would be the one to raise the dead and usher in the final renovation of the world. So, when the author of Matthew has Zoroastrian priests follow a star to a virgin-born child, he is not merely inventing a story, he is performing a masterful act of spiritual synthesis. He is weaving the messianic prophecies of Persia into the messianic prophecies of Israel, suggesting that both traditions were pointing to the same singular, universal truth from different directions. And this recognition culminates in their offering of the three gifts, a ritual act that is itself a profound esoteric teaching. These are not random precious treasures. They are a symbolic acknowledgement of the three planes of existence and of the recipient's mastery over all of them. Gold, the most stable and incorruptible of metals, has always been the symbol of the earth, of the physical plane, and of royalty. The offering of gold is the recognition of the child as a master of the material world, a true king. Frankincense is a resin that, when burned, releases a fragrant smoke that rises to the heavens. It has always been used in sacred rituals to communicate with the divine. The offering of frankincense is the recognition of the child's nature as a god, a master of the spiritual plane. And finally, myrrh. Myrrh is another sacred resin, but it was famously used in the ancient world for embalming the dead. It is the symbol of mortality, of sacrifice, and of the journey through death and transformation. The offering of myrrh is the recognition that this divine king is also fully human, an initiated master who will willingly walk the path of life and death. The Magi were not simply giving gifts. They were performing a ritual of initiation, declaring that they recognized in this child the one who had mastered all three worlds, the physical, the spiritual, and the mysterious passage that binds them together. The entire story hinges on their guide, a star that defies astronomical law, acting with intelligence and purpose. To understand this star is to move from history and theology into the realm of pure metaphysics. For centuries, scholars and astronomers have tried to pinpoint the Star of Bethlehem. Was it a comet, a supernova, a planetary conjunction? While these investigations are intellectually fascinating, they may miss the point entirely. The text of Matthew describes a star that behaves like no celestial object we know. It appears, it disappears, it moves to guide the Magi, and then it stops and hovers over a specific house. The ancient authors were not writing a scientific report. They were crafting a theological and metaphysical symbol of immense power. To decode the myth, we must analyze the star, not as a physical object, but as a multi-layered reality. The first layer of its reality is political. In the year 44 BC, shortly after the assassination of Julius Caesar, a brilliant comet blazed across the skies of Rome. This event was masterfully used by his heir, Octavian, as a sign that Caesar had ascended to the heavens and become a god. This Julian star became a central symbol of the imperial cult, stamped on coins and displayed on temples. It was a constant piece of propaganda that equated the emperor of Rome with divinity. So, when the author of Matthew, writing under Roman occupation, introduces a new miraculous star that heralds the birth of a true divine king, he is engaging in an act of profound spiritual subversion. He is declaring that the authority of the cosmos does not lie with the emperor in his palace, but with the divine potential hidden in the humblest of places. The second layer is prophetic. For any reader steeped in the Jewish tradition, the star would immediately evoke one of the most famous messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible, the prophecy of Balaam in the book of Numbers. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. For centuries, this verse was understood to foretell the coming of a great king, a liberator. The star in Matthew's Gospel is the author's declaration that this ancient prophecy has been fulfilled. It is the celestial sign that validates the child's claim to the throne of David, a signal legible to those who understood the sacred texts. But it is the third layer, the mystical layer, that reveals the star's deepest nature. As the story of the Magi was retold and expanded in the early Christian centuries, in texts that are now known as the Apocrypha, the star began to evolve. In these more mystical accounts, like the revelation of the Magi, the star is described as a light far brighter than the sun, a being that could speak and interact with the travelers. It was no longer a mere object in the sky, but a living intelligence, and in its ultimate metaphysical revelation, the star is identified as the pre-incarnate Christ himself, the Logos appearing in its purest form as a manifestation of divine light. In this profound understanding, the star does not simply lead the Magi to the Christ child. The star is the Christ, guiding the awakened mind to the recognition of its own divine source, which is then found mirrored in the child. The guide and the destination are one and the same. And here the myth asks us to consider a radical idea, one that resonates deeply with the core of mystical thought. What if profound shifts in human consciousness, moments of great spiritual significance, can actually imprint themselves onto the fabric of reality? What if the universe is not a silent, indifferent backdrop to human drama, but a responsive, conscious field that generates signs and symbols for those who have cultivated the eyes to see them? The star, in its truest sense, may be the external reflection of an internal event, the dawn of an enlightened awareness. For this myth to be a true myth, a piece of our spiritual source code, its pattern cannot be an isolated event. It must appear in other times, in other cultures, independent of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it is when we turn our investigation to the East that the local story of the Magi begins to reveal its universal, global significance. We find that this is not one story that was copied and retold, but a pattern that has emerged spontaneously from the human collective consciousness again and again. We will now look at two parallel data points that validate this claim. Our first data point comes from the sacred texts of India, specifically the Bhagavata Purana, which chronicles the life of the avatar Krishna. The text describes how, at the time of Krishna's birth, the planets and stars moved into uniquely auspicious alignments. The ancient sages, the rishis of the land who were masters of Vedic astrology, immediately recognized these celestial signs. They understood that a divine incarnation had taken place. The story then tells of a specific sage named Garga, the chief priest of the royal family, who was renowned for his esoteric knowledge. Compelled by the celestial portents, Garga travels in secret to the humble village of Vrindavan, where the infant Krishna is being hidden. There, in a private ceremony, he reveals to Krishna's foster parents the child's true divine nature and his destiny as a savior of the world. Notice the pattern: a divinely orchestrated birth, a recognition of the event by distant sages through the reading of celestial signs, the journey of the sage to the child, and the private confirmation of his world-altering significance. Our second data point takes us to the foothills of the Himalayas, to a story recorded in the Nalaka Sutta, one of the oldest texts in the Buddhist Pali Canon. The story tells of a revered sage and master of meditation named Asita, who was living a life of solitude in the mountains. One day he perceives a great and joyful disturbance among the devas, the celestial beings, and understands that a momentous event has occurred on earth. Following this divine sign, Asita journeys down from his mountain retreat to the palace of King Suddhodana. There he asks to see the king's newborn son, Siddhartha Gautama. The text says that upon seeing the infant, Asita's deep meditative insight allowed him to perceive the 32 marks of a great man on the child's body, the esoteric signs of a fully enlightened being. Overcome with emotion, he first smiles, recognizing that a Buddha, a fully awakened teacher for the world, has appeared. And then he weeps, knowing that he himself is too old and will not live to hear the profound wisdom this child will one day teach. Let us pause and consider the logic of this pattern. The staggering similarity of these accounts, separated by centuries of time and vast geographical and cultural distances, points to one inescapable conclusion. The names are different. The theological language is different. But the underlying myth, the true myth, is identical, a divinely significant birth. A perception of this event by awakened sages from a distance, through signs celestial or intuitive. The deliberate journey of the sage to the child. The recognition of the child's status as a world teacher, and the offering of reverence. This is not just a collection of charming stories. This is a description of a fundamental process of reality, a recurring dynamic between the human and the divine. And it begs the most important question of all. What is this universal pattern trying to tell us about ourselves and about the very nature of consciousness? We have followed this thread from the mountains of ancient Persia, through the revolutionary pages of a gospel, to the sacred histories of India and the Himalayas. We have seen the same story, the same spiritual source code running in different cultural operating systems. Now, we arrive at the great synthesis, the moment we connect all these points and reveal the core of the true myth. The ultimate revelation is this. The story of the Magi is not, in its deepest sense, describing an external event that happened to a few people long ago. It is describing an internal capacity, an innate faculty of human consciousness. We might call this the sage faculty. Just as the human mind has innate faculties for language, for logic, and for musical harmony, it also possesses a faculty for the perception of deep patterns of meaning and for the recognition of the sacred. It is a part of our consciousness that, when developed, can sense the presence of the Logos, the divine intelligence, as it moves and manifests within the world. The historical Magi, the Indian Rishi, the Himalayan sage Asita, these are not just characters in a story. They are personifications of this faculty in its fully awakened state. They are archetypes of the part of the human mind that has been trained, disciplined, and refined to the point where it can perceive a deeper layer of reality. In this light, the entire myth becomes a map of an internal process. The journey of the Magi is the journey of the seeker's own mind. The quest itself, the deliberate act of seeking truth, is what activates this dormant sage faculty within us. It is the conscious choice to say, I am willing to look beyond the surface of things. I am willing to search for a deeper meaning. This intention is the first and most critical step. The star, then, is not some random external light. It is the perfect symbol for our own intuition, that subtle guiding sense that pulls us forward. But this is not the vague, untrustworthy intuition of whim or emotion. As the myth shows, the Magi were masters of a sacred science. Their intuition was a finely calibrated instrument, trained and sharpened by deep knowledge and disciplined observation. The star is the signal that emerges when our rational mind and our intuitive heart begin to work in harmony. It is the inner guidance that we learn to trust because we have done the work to build a worthy vessel to receive it. And the destination of this journey, the world teacher found in the humble manger, is the recognition of the divine self within. It is the discovery of that sacred, incorruptible core of our own being, the spark of the universal consciousness that resides within us. The journey of the sage faculty, guided by a calibrated intuition, is the journey back to our own spiritual center. The true myth of the Magi, in its final analysis, is the story of how our own seeking, conscious mind finds its way home to the divine presence that was waiting within us all along. Understanding this myth as a map of our own inner potential is the first step. But the final lesson of the Magi is not a passive realization. It is an imperative, a call to a certain way of being in the world. The role of the true Magus, both ancient and modern, is not one of detached observation, but of active, conscious participation in the unfolding of reality. This active path, this modern quest, is sustained by three foundational pillars that are as relevant today as they were in the courts of Persia. The first pillar is the commitment to your sacred science. For the ancient Magi, this was the discipline of astrology, a complex language for interpreting the cosmos. In our time, we are not asked to adopt their specific science, but to embrace its underlying principle, the imperative of rigorous and sincere study. For the modern seeker, our sacred science is the art of synthesis. It is the deep and disciplined commitment to study the great traditions of wisdom psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, and the world's mystical lineages, not to merely accumulate facts, but to build a functional, coherent model of reality and consciousness. It is the work of separating timeless wisdom from cultural artifacts, of finding the universal patterns beneath the surface details. This pillar demands that our search for truth be intellectually honest, open-minded, and relentless. The second pillar is the cultivation of your star. The star that guided the Magi was not a random light. It was a specific signal they were prepared to see. For us, this star is not an external sign, but an internal one, a finely calibrated intuition. This is not the intuition of pure feeling or wishful thinking. It is an intuition that has been earned, sharpened, and made reliable through the hard work of the first pillar. When you have deeply studied the patterns of the human mind and the nature of reality, your intuitive faculty becomes a powerful instrument of discernment. It becomes the ability to feel the difference between the signal and the noise, to sense the next right step, not out of emotional caprice, but because your entire inner system has been trained to recognize the signature of the logos, the resonance of truth. This is the inner GPS that guides the quest. The third and final pillar is the courage of your journey. Knowledge and intuition, no matter how profound, are impotent without the courage to act upon them. This is the imperative to embody your deepest understanding, to live in accordance with your truth. The journey is the conscious choice to leave the safety and certainty of the known map, the collective beliefs of your tribe, your culture, and your past self, in order to follow the faint light of your inner star. This is where the quest becomes real. It demands the courage to face the Herods of your own life, the internal voices of fear, self-doubt, and cynicism, and the external pressures of social convention and the expectations of others. It is the unwavering commitment to allow your inner truth to become your outer reality. Study, intuition, and action. These are the three pillars that transform a passive believer into an active Magus. We have traveled a great distance, from a single name carved into a Persian mountain, through the esoteric heart of a gospel, across the plains of India and the peaks of the Himalayas, and finally, into the inner architecture of consciousness itself. The journey of the Magi, in its fullest revelation, shows us that the most profound quest is not for a savior in the past, but for the activation of the sage within us, in the living present. And this brings us to the final gift, the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh. These were the symbolic gestures, the outer acknowledgments of a truth they perceived. But the real gift the Magi offered, the true culmination of their long and arduous journey, was something far more essential. It was their presence. Consider what this means. It was not a distracted, casual, or obligatory presence. It was a focused, reverent, and fully awakened attention. After all their years of study, their meticulous observation of the heavens, their perilous journey across deserts and mountains, they arrived at their destination and offered the totality of their being to the significance of that moment. They offered the gift of pure, unadulterated presence. This was the ultimate act of recognition, the final harmonization of the seeker with the sought. The true imperative of the modern Magus, the final instruction encoded in this myth, is to make this same offering to the world, not in a single sacred location from a time long past, but in the unfolding fabric of every moment. The great spiritual quest for enlightenment, for truth, for God, culminates in the simple but monumental task of being fully present to the life that is right in front of us, to offer our undivided attention to our work, to our relationships, to our own inner world. The myth of the Magi does not ask you to believe in their story. It invites you to live your own. It does not ask you to follow their star. It invites you to become your own, to become that guiding light of conscious, focused presence in your own small corner of the world. The quest never ends. It simply becomes your life. If this quest resonates with you, our conversation continues in the comments. What does it mean for you to embody the Magus imperative in your life today?